My name is Evelyn Price, and that night in the church garden, I heard a man whisper a question so painful, it felt like it was carved out of my own bones. Why does my house no longer feel like home since they got married? His voice cracked like a dry twig, and before I even turned to look at him, I already felt as if I had lived that moment myself. I had, in a way. That single question dragged up years of silence, humiliation, and the slow kind of heartbreak that only family can deliver. It was the kind of moment where you either look away and pretend you never heard it, or you sit down beside the man and let him know he's not alone. And I could never walk away from a kind of pain I recognized. The garden outside St. Matthew's was half lit by the old lampposts the church council kept promising to fix. The air smelled like damp leaves and last week's cut grass. The stained glass windows glowed behind us, red and blue saints looking down like they already knew every sin happening inside every house in town. I had been on my way to lock up the fellowship hall when I saw him hunched over on the stone bench, elbows on his knees, like he was carrying more than his body had strength for. At first, I thought he might be praying. Then I heard the words, and I realized he was unraveling. He didn't look at me right away. Most folks don't when they're saying the kind of truth they've worked years to swallow. I eased myself down onto the bench beside him, careful not to move too quickly. Men raised on quiet dignity and hard work carry a kind of pride that bruises easier than skin. I waited until he took a shaky breath before I spoke. "Tell me what happened," I said, not as a question, but as permission. He ran a hand down his face and finally turned toward me. His cheeks were weathered, the kind you only get from decades under the sun, farming maybe, or construction, or working a yard everyone else took for granted. His gray eyes were swollen not from fresh tears, but from tears he'd been holding back too long. "It started small," he murmured. "Real small. Little things I figured didn't mean anything." He paused, and I didn't push. "My son? He married a girl named Laura. Pretty thing. Sharp tongue, though. I should have known the first day she came into our house and started moving things around without asking." He shook his head, trying to laugh, but it died hollow. Next thing I know, my recliner was in the garage, and I was being told I needed a lighter chair that fit the style of the living room. I let it go. "You know how it is. Pick your battles." I nodded because I did know, too well. Then she started deciding what groceries went in the pantry, what shows could be watched in the evening, what pictures stayed on the wall. His voice tightened. My wife's picture. The one that sat on the mantel 30 years. She said it made her uncomfortable having another woman staring down at her. He clenched his jaw until it trembled. My boy let her box it up. That part hit me like a slap I'd already felt in another life. I swallowed hard and cleared my throat, willing my heartbeat to behave. He continued, words spilling with the tired rhythm of someone who'd replayed it 100 nights. "Then I wasn't invited to the grocery run. Then I wasn't included in family plans. Then my son told me maybe I should think about sleeping downstairs so they could start their life upstairs without interference." Interference, he repeated, like the word offended his very soul. In my own damn house. A breeze rustled through the garden, and I swear even the leaves leaned in to listen. "Last week," he said, finally I came home from a walk, and there was a lock on the door to what used to be my bedroom. My son looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, we need space." He didn't cry then. He looked like a man who had turned into stone to avoid shattering. "Evelyn, I built that house with my own hands. And somehow I'm the one that doesn't fit in it anymore." My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. I wanted to take his hand, but some men need their dignity more than they need comfort. So I straightened my back and let my own scars speak through my voice. It happened to me too, I said quietly. He turned, startled, and in that moment, the loneliness in his eyes flickered just a little with relief. I told him how I once shared a roof with my son and his wife after my husband passed. How it began with tiny rearrangements changes I convinced myself were harmless. How I gave up my pantry shelf, then my seat at the table, and finally the master bedroom I had painted with my own hands. I told him about the day I realized I was being treated like a long-term guest, instead of the woman who raised the man paying the mortgage. How I overheard my daughter-in-law tell her friend on the phone that she just couldn't breathe with the old woman still in the house. How I walked outside and sat in my car for an hour so I wouldn't scream. How I left, not because they asked, but because dignity demanded I stop waiting for the day they finally would. He blinked, absorbing it like a lifeline. And that's why I'm here, I said. Not to pray for them, but to learn how to live again without apologizing for being alive. The man nodded slowly, like he was tasting each word for truth. For the first time since I sat down, his shoulders loosened. You have more power than you think, I whispered, and you are not done. The church bell rang in the distance, 9 slow chimes that felt like a promise. Hope doesn't always come roaring in. Sometimes it settles next to you on a cold bench in a church garden, wrapped in quiet clarity and the faint smell of lilies. He didn't come back to the garden the next night, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. Not the wrinkles around his eyes or the rough shake in his voice, but the way he said the word interference, like it was a sin he never meant to commit. In the days that followed, I started seeing him everywhere in my mind, sharp as a knife-folded shoulders, hands resting like heavy stones on his knees. And every time the phone rang at the church office, I half expected it to be him. I told myself not to get invested. Lives cross like threads in this town, sometimes weaving, sometimes breaking. But I've never been the sort of woman who could pretend someone else's pain wasn't my business. Not when it mirrored my own. Thursday morning, just before choir practice, I finally saw him again. He stood at the coffee urn in the fellowship hall, staring into a styrofoam cup like it was a crystal ball. The bingo ladies were fussing around tables, putting out hymn sheets, and wiping down chairs that didn't need wiping. But he stood perfectly still, an island in the noise. I walked over slowly. Coffee that bad? He huffed one of those half-laughs men use when they want to pretend a heartbreak hasn't followed them out the door. I've had worse, he said. Army coffee makes this stuff taste gourmet. I poured myself a cup and motioned him toward the table farthest from the choir chatter. You're back? I said. He sat across from me, the steam curling between us. Didn't know where else to go, he finally replied. Can only walk the same streets so many times before they start to feel ashamed of you. I tilted my head. Town doesn't shame people. People do. His eyes flicked up. Yeah, people. We sat quiet for a beat. Not awkward, just letting the air settle. You didn't finish the story, I said gently. He rubbed his thumb along the cup rim. Last night, I slept in my truck. I didn't let my expression change, though my heart punched hard against my ribs. Because they threw you out. No, he said. Worse, they didn't notice I was gone. He told me how he packed a pillow and blanket from the basement, how he parked on the street 2 blocks down from the house he built, so he could see the porch light. Not one person opened the door. Looked out the window. Texted. Nothing. That's not forgetting, I said softly. That's choosing. He nodded, eyes distant. Thought maybe he'd need his father. Maybe something in that house would feel wrong without me in it. And did it? He folded his hands. No, lights out by 10, like the place never had a history. We stayed there for a long time while the choir squeaked their way through half-remembered harmonies. When the last note died, he looked at me with something between shame and resolve. You said the other night you'd been through this, he said. How did you make the house feel like yours again? I took a breath. Answers always come too easily in hindsight. Living it had been mud and bruises. I didn't, I said. I walked away. He blinked. That easy? Easy! I laughed once without humor. Honey, I drove around for an hour crying so no one would hear me. Then I checked into a motel off Route 30 because I didn't have the spine to knock on a friend's door. I leaned forward. But I decided something in that cheap motel room, if a house only has space for me when it's convenient, it's no home of mine. He looked at the table as though seeing a map spread across it. My son used to bring home frogs in his pockets, he whispered. He used to tell me the house was his fort and I was his hero. He paused, his voice trembling at the edges. When did I stop being that? That's not the right question, I said. Ask instead, when did he forget? He rubbed his jaw. Maybe I didn't raise him right. Or maybe I said carefully he married someone who doesn't know how to share her territory, and he hasn't learned how to draw a line. That landed. He sat straighter. Lines, he repeated quietly. My coffee had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. I wanted to give him something he could hold on to like a railing in the dark. You have more claim to that home than she does, I said, but you won't win back respect by waiting for permission. His brow furrowed. What do I do then? First, I said you stop sleeping in the truck. He actually smiled, small but real. Second, I continued, you remember what belongs to you, your dignity, your history, and the right to be treated like a father, not a roommate. He breathed in, slow, letting that sink in. And third, I added, you stop being ashamed of telling the truth. Shame only works if you stay quiet. He nodded, and I saw something I hadn't seen before in him. Anger, not the violent kind, but the righteous kind that wakes a man up. Can I come tomorrow? He asked. I think I'm going to need help figuring out what to do. Every church door has 2 hinges, I said. Come through whichever one opens easiest. He laughed again, louder this time. The bingo ladies shot us suspicious looks. Laughter during choir cleanup is considered a minor scandal in a small-town parish. When we walked toward the exit, he paused beneath the stained lamp at the side door. What if my son hates me afterward, he asked. I squeezed his arm gently. If your child hates you for standing up for yourself, then he already left you long before you leave his house. He exhaled shakily, but his shoulders, those shoulders lifted slightly. We stepped into the bright morning air. Behind us, the choir tried to fix a flat note. Ahead of us, something like courage began to take shape. He came back the next afternoon carrying a notebook, a pen, and a look that told me he'd been awake most of the night. He wasn't pacing or wringing his hands anymore. He walked into the fellowship hall like a man who had made a decision, not the full decision yet, but the first one you make before all the others line up. I was wiping down the long tables after the senior lunch crowd cleared out. Chicken noodle soup, cornbread, and stories about arthritis, it never changes. He nodded at me like we were already in something together. I figured if I'm gonna dig myself out of this mess, he said, lifting the notebook, I ought to start writing down the truth of it. I smiled. Truth looks a lot less scary when it's on paper. He sat down and opened the first page. It was blank, except for the date in the top corner, and his name, Jacob. I hadn't even known his name until then, and somehow seeing it written made him feel more real than any conversation we'd had so far. They ever give you the basement, I asked? He snorted. I gave it back to them. He told me he walked into the house that morning while his daughter-in-law was on her yoga mat without announcing himself. Took his pillow from the basement, took his spare clothes, and took the framed picture of his wife from the garage shelf where they dumped it. Then he walked back out, ignoring every indignant, "Where are you going?" that followed him. That's the first time I've taken back anything in months, he said. I felt like I was stealing from strangers. I remembered that exact feeling, like leaving your own house made you a trespasser. It was the quietest form of heartbreak I'd ever lived through.
Good, I said. You're waking up.
We sat while he scribbled, stopping occasionally to ask questions most grown men shouldn't have to ask. Do I list the times I paid the mortgage? Do I write down the groceries, the repairs, the hospital bills after his broken arm in 8th grade?
Yes, I told him. Write it all. Someday you might need proof you mattered.
And then the dam broke. It started as soft words muttered while his pen scratched. The night my wife died. The night I held my boy and told him he'd always have me.
Then louder, I sold my tractor so they could afford the down payment, paid his tuition at Ivy Tech when he dropped out of Purdue, drove him to every interview until he got hired. I never once asked for anything back.
By the time he reached the bottom of the page, anger had edged into his voice, not wild anger, but the tired, righteous kind that comes from adding up receipts you never meant to tally.
He paused and looked up at me. Why is it always the ones we give the most to who forget the fastest?
I breathed slowly. Because they get used to receiving, and you taught him to believe you'd always be there. He let that sit for a minute, like tasting bitterness he couldn't spit out.
You ever tell your son how you felt, he asked me suddenly. I froze a moment before answering. No, I didn't have the courage back then. I folded the rag I'd been cleaning with. I thought love meant staying quiet and understanding everything. Turns out, love sometimes means speaking out before you disappear. He nodded, like that was something his heart had been waiting for someone to say.
We spent a long time going back and forth about what came next. He asked if he should confront his son right away, maybe demand his share back, maybe force the issue.
Not yet, I said gently. First you figure out what you want, not just what hurts.
He rubbed his temple. I just want my son back.
That's a hope, I said, not a plan.
He laughed at that one short breath that softened the lines on his face. For a second, I saw what he used to look like, younger, steadier, sure of what his life was. The door creaked open and the pastor poked his head in. Pastor Allen, a man with a kind face and pants that always needed ironing.
Everything okay in here? He asked.
Jacob sat up straighter.
Just talking.
Pastor Allen nodded the way pastors do when they know more than they're saying. Sometimes, he said, we have to lose the room we're standing in before we realize we were meant for a different one.
Jacob blinked. That's supposed to mean something.
Allen smiled.
Maybe.
After he left, Jacob leaned toward me like a man about to confess something heavy.
You think I'm cowardly for staying as long as I did.
No, I said. I think you're loyal, and loyalty lasts longer than welcome.
The fellowship hall clock ticked loud enough to fill the whole room.
Then Jacob's expression shifted, firmed. Something clicked into place inside him.
I'm not staying invisible, he said.
Not anymore.
And if they treat me like I don't exist, I'm going to show them exactly what that looks like.
He pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a long moment before he typed a single text to his son.
We need to talk. Tonight, non-negotiable. He looked at me after he hit send. Whatever happens next, I'm not going back to who I was last week.
I wanted to hug him, but I didn't. Instead, I stood and placed my hand on the back of his chair, steady as a fence post.
You're not alone, I said, and you're not done.
As he walked out of the fellowship hall, the notebook clutched to his side. I saw the faintest outline of a man becoming someone new. Not the father who had been pushed out of rooms, but the man who was about to open his own door again. Evening sunlight filtered through the tall windows, throwing gold patches across the empty tables. For the first time in years, I felt like something was shifting, not just for him, but for me. Pain shared becomes lighter. And sometimes, two wounded people standing side by side can create a strength neither one had alone. He called me the moment the talk was over.
The phone rang just past 10 after I'd finished washing my face and slipping into the old cotton nightgown I wore to bed most nights. His voice shook so hard I thought something terrible had happened. I braced myself, heart pounding, ready for the worst. But when he finally spoke, the tremor in his tone wasn't fear. It was disbelief. Maybe even grief mixed with relief. "It's done," he said. I said every word I've swallowed for the last 2 years. I sat down on my couch as if the weight of his confession needed a piece of furniture to help carry it. "Start from the beginning," I murmured. He took a breath, shaky but steadying. I walked in the front door like I belonged there. Didn't knock, didn't pause, just walked in. I closed my eyes, imagining it, the shuffle of shoes across hardwood, the familiar smell of a house that's no longer yours. My daughter-in-law was sitting on the couch, he continued. She looked up like I was a stranger who barged in without permission. I told her I wasn't in the mood for games and that I'd come to talk to my son. "She say anything?" "Oh yeah," he said, "plenty." The bitterness in his laugh told me everything. She said, "Maybe you should call first Jacob. People have boundaries now." I could practically see her, the tidy throw pillows, the practiced tone, the smile sharpened just enough to cut skin. I told her my house wasn't built on boundaries, he said. It was built on love, sweat, and calluses. Then my son came down the stairs, and I swear he looked smaller and older at the same time. His voice softened, turning inward. He asked if I was okay, and I told him, "No, I haven't been okay since the day I stopped being your father and became your roommate." I felt that line like a punch. I'd lived that moment myself, realizing love had quietly shifted into obligation. "What did he say?" I asked. Nothing. At first, he stood there like a kid caught lying about breaking the cookie jar. I could picture him, clearly grown man, suddenly shrinking into someone much younger when confronted by truth. "So I kept going," Jacob said. I told him everything I'd written down. Every humiliation. Every time I disappeared a little more. Every time he let her make decisions that erased me. And then he paused. And then I pressed. I told him I was moving out permanently, and that I was taking my share of the house with me. There was silence on the line, but it wasn't empty. It was full of release of years lifted all at once. "You said those exact words," I breathed. "Every last one, and then some." His breath hitched. He asked me what I meant by my share, and that's when she came storming in like the wolf had been let loose in her henhouse. I could hear the tiny rush of satisfaction in his voice, the kind that comes when someone who pushed too far suddenly meets resistance. She said, "You can't just take part of our house." And I told her, "Lady, I built this house. I paid for it. I patched every hole and replaced every roof shingle. You don't get to tell me what belongs to me." The mixture of pride and pain in his voice was thick enough to catch in my throat. And then he whispered, "I told them I was rewriting my will." That line came out like a bell toll. "My son looked like someone had slapped him," Jacob added quietly. She turned white, and I realized right then they didn't fear losing me. They feared losing what I could give them. A long pause stretched between us, heavy, honest. "What happened after that?" I asked softly. "They asked me to stay, to talk it out, to be reasonable." His voice tightened again. And I told them I had been reasonable for 2 years. Reasonable is what got me shut in a basement. A tear slid down my cheek before I could stop it, not for him, but for myself, for every older parent who swallowed their voice until it soured inside them. So I took my coat, my picture of Emily, his wife, and my truck keys, and I left. This time for good. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say, not until the dust settled in his chest. Finally, I asked the question I knew mattered most. "Do you regret it?" "No," he said. "Not tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe next week. But not tonight."
I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath the whole time. You did something brave.
It didn't feel brave,
He muttered.
It felt like cutting my heart in half.
That's what bravery feels like, I whispered. Thunder rumbled somewhere far off, just enough to remind us the world was wider than our wounds. He cleared his throat.
You were right, he said. About shame. It only works if you stay quiet.
There was a long silence then, one of the warm ones, the kind that wraps around you like an old quilt. Finally, he said, "Thank you, Evelyn, for being on that bench, for listening." "You don't owe me thanks," I said. "Just don't disappear from yourself again."
He chuckled, tired. I won't.
We said goodnight. But I sat with the phone still in my hand long after the line went quiet. I looked around my little 2-bedroom apartment, my fresh start, after leaving my own son's home. For the first time, it didn't feel like a downgrade. It felt like a place chosen, a place earned. And in that moment, as the rain started pattering against my windows, I knew the story wasn't over. Not for him, not for me, not for anyone who ever loved a child enough to let them grow and then learned the hardest truth of all. Sometimes love means letting them walk on without you, and sometimes justice means walking away first. He didn't call the next day, and then he didn't call the day after that. By day 3, I found myself glancing at the church phone, my cell phone, even the bulletin board, where people sometimes leave messages pinned with thumbtacks and crossed fingers. Nothing. I told myself he needed time, that a man doesn't rip up his roots and plant new ones overnight. But if I'm honest, and stories like this don't mean much without honesty, I worried. Not that he'd gone back, but that guilt had crept in. Guilt is the last weapon ungrateful children ever need to wield, because parents carry it in their hearts already. So by Saturday morning, I baked banana bread warm the way he said his wife used to make it and drove to his place. It wasn't his house anymore, not officially, but I knew to find him there before he'd sorted out where home would be now. His truck was in the driveway, but the blinds were drawn like a house asleep in the middle of the day. I knocked softly. No answer. Then a little firmer. Still nothing. I thought about leaving the bread and a note. But then a board creaked inside, and the door cracked open 2 inches, just enough for an eye lined with fatigue. "Evelyn." He said my name with surprise, but not reluctance. "You planning on hiding forever?" I asked gently. He sighed and opened the door wider. He looked smaller, older somehow, like the weight of freedom had pressed down instead of lifted up. His beard had gone a shade scruffier. And there were those empty cardboard boxes near the wall, half packed, half abandoned, like he couldn't decide what belonged to him anymore. "Come in," he muttered. The house felt different. Not cold, exactly, just hollow. Quiet in a way houses should never be. It smelled like dust and lemon cleaner, not like cooking, or laughter, or living. "You okay?" I asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Depends on the minute." He took a breath. "I haven't heard from him." Of course that was it. People can throw you out easier than they can let you go. "Did you expect him to?" I asked. A part of me did. He shook his head. "That boy used to call me twice a day, once about homework, once about dinner. Now he can let 3 days go by without wondering if I'm breathing." I put the bread down on the counter. "You are allowed to grieve the man your son used to be," I said. "But you don't get to shrink because he did." He met my eyes then, and I saw something raw and jagged in them. I don't know who I am without being his father in that house. I took a slow breath. The truth I had learned tasted bitter at first, but then it strengthened me like medicine. "You're still his father," I said. "But fathers deserve lives of their own too." He rubbed his palms together, the sound dry and restless. I feel like I jumped without checking where I'd land.
And I asked, "And I'm not sure there's a landing," he whispered. I patted the chair beside me. "Sit, let's make a landing." He finally sat down at the kitchen table, and I could swear the chair creaked in relief to hold a man who'd spent too much time standing alone. "What now?" he asked, voice a hush. "Now," I said carefully, "you start building something that's yours again, one brick at a time." He raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly does a man my age do that?" "First," I said, ticking off a finger, "we find you somewhere to live that doesn't come with ghosts in the walls." He snorted. "You got a magic wand?" "No," I smiled. "But I have a church bulletin full of spare rooms, senior apartments, and folks who'll give you coffee and company." He leaned back. Something loosened in him, if only a thread. "And second," he asked, "you take care of yourself like you matter." I pushed the bread toward him. "Starting with lunch." He laughed once and tore off a piece. "My Emily used to say the same thing. Eat something before you make a decision." "Smart woman," I said. He nodded. Smarter than me. We sat quietly while he ate. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the house filled with warmth again, not from stoves or heaters, but from presence. When the moment felt steady enough, I reached into my purse and placed something on the table. A typed list. 5 names, 5 phone numbers, each one with elder care attorney or family property consultant next to it. He lifted the paper like it was fragile. "You did this." "I lived through it," I said. "I figured you shouldn't have to stumble the way I did." He swallowed hard. "I keep thinking I should just let it all go. Not fight. Just walk away. And leave them the house. The savings." "The right to pretend you never existed?" I asked softly. "Is that the story you want written?" He sat up straighter. "No." "Then don't talk like a man who's already lost." He nodded slowly. A muscle worked in his jaw. "I'll call one of them. Monday." "Call 2, I said. "One might not answer." He smiled. "You're bossier than you look." "I earned the right," I replied. It wasn't a grand turning point, not fireworks or a speech or some dramatic courtroom showdown. Not yet. But it was the moment a man decided his life wasn't finished just because someone else decided they were done with him. We stood by the doorway, and he looked back over his shoulder at the house, the walls that had listened to his prayers, the floors that felt his footsteps learning to walk beside his son's smaller ones. "I never thought I'd leave a home willingly," he murmured. "That's because you never imagined a home would leave you first," I said quietly. He nodded, wiped at his eyes like a man tired of pretending not to cry. "Thank you," he whispered. "You'll thank me more when this is over," I said. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped outside into the soft afternoon light. And for the first time, I didn't see him as a man being pushed out of his life. I saw him as a man walking into the next chapter. He showed up at the church office on Monday morning, looking like a man who hadn't slept, but had finally made a decision. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and his eyes red not from crying, but from thinking too long and too hard. But beneath the rough edges, something in him had solidified. He walked straighter. He spoke slower. He looked like a man who had stopped apologizing for his own existence. "I called 2 lawyers," he said, holding up his phone like a trophy. "One called back already. I meet him tomorrow." I clapped my hands, once quiet but proud. That's more than half the battle. He exhaled hard, as if he'd been holding the sentence in for 3 days. Part of me feels terrible for doing it. Another part of me feels like I should have done it a year ago. "Both parts are true," I said. "Feelings get to coexist before they cancel out." He laughed a little. "You missed your calling. You should have been a counselor." I shook my head. I've lived enough hurt to skip the training. We walked to the fellowship hall and sat in our usual corner. Sunbeams came through the tall windows, dust floating like tiny flecks of possibility. Jacob set the phone on the table between us like it was a loaded question. "What happens if I lose?" he asked. "You won't," I said, steady as a hymn. "Not this time." "Legally or morally?" he pressed. "Both."
He nodded, but fear tugged at the corners of his shoulders. I saw the child inside the father, the boy who wanted to be loved more than he wanted justice. And that's the hardest part about this kind of fight, when winning still feels like losing something precious.
He glanced toward the sanctuary. "There's a part of me that keeps hoping he'll show up here. Walk in with that sheepish grin and say, 'Dad, let's fix this.'"
"Maybe he will," I said, "but not because you bend. If he comes back, it needs to be because he grew."
He scratched his chin. "Hard lesson for a parent." "Necessary one," I replied.
We sat that way for a while, silent but not empty. The way widows and widowers sit beside graves, accepting what is gone and deciding how to honor what remains.
Jacob drummed his fingers on the table. "You think I should tell the pastor what's happening?" "If you want community behind you," I said yes.
He nodded and stood. We found Pastor Allen tucked into his office, surrounded by books and stacks of printed sermons that all smelled like ink and time.
Pastor Jacob began, voice low. "I need to talk to you man to man, not like a sinner to a saint." Allen leaned back, laced fingers over his stomach, and nodded. "Go on."
Jacob walked him through everything: the erasure, the humiliation, the basement bed, the locked door, the leaving. The pastor listened without interrupting, even when Jacob's voice cracked.
When he finished, Allen said only 4 words. "You're doing the right thing."
Jacob blinked. "I keep thinking I'm being selfish." Allen shook his head slowly. "Selfishness is grabbing power. You're reclaiming dignity. They're not the same." Those words hit him like scripture he didn't know he'd been waiting for.
"And regardless of what happens next," Allen added, "you have a pew here, a room here, and a name. We'll speak with respect."
Jacob swallowed hard. "Thank you." When we stepped outside, he took a deep breath, like the oxygen in the world had just doubled. That afternoon, we sat in the empty church garden. The same bench where this all began. The same patch of worn stone, same halo of colored light through stained glass. Except everything felt different now, like the bench was holding up a man instead of a sorrow. "I want to see the look on her face," he admitted, "when she realizes she doesn't get everything she planned on."
"Then show her," I said, calmly, legally, with your spine straight and your lawyer beside you. He smiled with a wicked glimmer. "You sure you're not the devil on my shoulder?" "I'm the angel with paperwork," I replied.
We both laughed loud enough that a couple walking by glanced at us like we were breaking some unwritten rule about sacred spaces.
"Do you think this will change him?" he asked. "My son, I mean."
"No," I said. "Confrontation rarely changes the one you confront, but consequences do." He nodded slowly, his face tightening into resolve. "And if he still chooses her over me," he whispered.
"Then you'll know what kind of man he is," I said, "and you'll build a life without waiting for his permission."
He sat with that chewed it like hard bread. Then he looked at me with something new in his eyes. Pride. Ownership of his own story.
"I bought a rental application," he said suddenly. "Senior community over near Jefferson Street. They have a garden club."
I grinned. The world starts opening fast once you stop letting someone else shut the doors. "And maybe," he said, voice softening, "maybe he'll come around. Maybe distance will make him miss me."
"Maybe," I said, "but don't live your life waiting for that doorbell." He nodded. "I won't."
He stood and stretched back, cracking like thunder. A man uncurling himself from years of small rooms and smaller expectations. When we walked back toward the parking lot, he held his keys differently, not like a man trying to unlock a house someone stole from him, but like a man choosing where he would go next. At the edge of the lot, he turned to me. "You saved me," he said.
"No," I answered. "You just needed someone to remind you where the exit was." He smiled at that wide enough to erase a decade off his face.
And as he drove away, I realized something profound and terrifying.
Revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's a quiet signature on a lease, a phone call to a lawyer, a man choosing not to sleep in a truck anymore, a father deciding that if home won't love him, he'll build one that does. And somewhere in a living room that wasn't ours to care about anymore, a young woman and her husband would eventually find out that the house they guarded so fiercely was never fully theirs to keep. He moved out on a Thursday, not at midnight, not in the heat of an argument, not with police lights painting the driveway red and blue. No, he left in daylight while the sun was shining, while mailboxes stood quiet on the curb, while no one in the neighborhood had any reason to stare out their windows. He drove his truck right up to the house, walked in, and packed the last of his things with his head high. 3 shirts, a winter coat, a handful of keepsakes, and 2 photo albums no one else in that house cared about.
I wasn't there, but I know how a man walks when he's done being erased. He told me later what happened, and I could see it in my mind as clearly as if I'd stood in that doorway myself.
His daughter-in-law came clacking down the stairs in heels too loud for hardwood and said, "You can't just take things. We need to discuss this." He replied, "We had 2 years to discuss it." His son followed her, sullen and silent-looking, like a small boy caught in the middle of adults he didn't know how to control. When Jacob shouldered the box containing his wife's quilt, a patchwork of old shirts, church dresses, and scrap apron fabric, the daughter-in-law reached for it and snapped. That was part of the house.
He stepped back, voice steady enough to cut glass. That was part of her. And she never belonged to you.
Silence, the first kind they've ever truly listened to.
Jacob walked past them both and out the door. By the time he told me the story, he was sitting on the edge of his new bed, a modest room in a senior living community overlooking a courtyard with maple trees that would turn gold in autumn. He had the phone pressed to his ear, but I heard that room in his breathing. Space, light, air.
"Feels strange," he admitted. "Like being 19 again and walking out into the world for the first time. Except now I reminded him you know better." He chuckled softly. "Yeah, I know what a bad deal looks like."
He hadn't cried yet. I kept waiting for the flood that always comes when a man realizes the life he lived for decades is now behind him. Instead, he sounded cautious, like someone who'd crossed a bridge that crumbled behind him and was afraid to check if he was standing on solid ground.
"How's it look?" I asked. He hesitated only a second. "Peaceful." Peace, a word so small yet so extravagant for parents of grown children. In the days that followed, Jacob didn't hide. He joined the garden club. He discovered that the place offered woodworking in the rec center. He found a group of men his age who met for coffee and complained about politics, gas prices, and their hips' simple, ordinary conversation that mends broken pieces faster than you realize. And then one quiet morning, his phone rang.
"I knew it would," I said when he showed up at my door, face pale with shock.
"It's him," he said. "My son." "Do you want to answer?" I asked.
He swallowed hard. "I don't know."
The phone rang again.
"Pick it up," I said softly. "But don't pick up your heartbreak."
He nodded and stepped outside into my small porch garden, potted geraniums, chipped paint, Virginia creeper crawling up the railing, and pressed the phone to his ear. I stayed inside, giving him privacy, but every parent knows the way a voice shapes itself when it's talking to a child, hope and hurt braided into one thread. I heard nothing but muffled tones through the screen door, but when Jacob came back inside, his face told the whole conversation. He asked where I've been, he said, voice hoarse. "And what did you say?" I told him I've been exactly where he pushed me out. I nodded. "And And then he said he didn't know how bad it had gotten, that he thought I was fine. People believe what makes life easiest for them, I murmured.
He sank into the chair at my kitchen table, the same one he'd sat in when shame weighed more than pride. This time, he looked heavier and lighter all at once.
He asked why I'd taken lawyers into it. He continued, fingers digging into his kneecaps. Said I blindsided him.
And what did you say?
I said silence blindsided me first.
For a long moment, neither of us spoke.
Finally, he said slowly. He asked if we could talk. Just the two of us.
That sounds like progress, I offered. It does, he agreed. But I told him we do it on neutral ground. Not in that house. Not anymore.
Good. He ran a hand through his hair. We're meeting at Denny's tonight.
Get the meatloaf, I said. It tastes like someone apologized in the recipe. He huffed out a laugh so sudden I nearly cried from the sound of it.
That evening, I waited not by the phone, but in spirit, imagining the meeting at a sticky booth with laminated menus and overhead lights humming like cicadas. Later, a text buzzed through. He apologized, not a perfect one, but he tried.
My heart swelled. Said he didn't know how to stand up to her. Progress always limps before it walks. I told him love without backbone is just polite surrender. I sat with the words long after the screen dimmed.
We're gonna try again, came the last message. Slowly. On my terms this time. On his terms, finally. A week later, I met Jacob at the church garden again.
He looked 10 years younger. His shoulders lifted, his chest open to the sky.
He came over yesterday, he said. Just him, no her. We grilled hot dogs, talked about wood projects and old memories. It felt like the house was home again, even though it wasn't his house anymore.
And the daughter-in-law, I asked? He shrugged, still not speaking to me, and I don't need her to. We sat together on that stone bench, the same place where grief began. Now, a place where hope collected like morning dew.
Funny thing, Jacob said. I thought revenge meant taking something from them.
And now I asked, now I think it means giving myself back the life they tried to shrink. Wind rustled through the trees, scattering leaves like blessings. He turned to me, eyes bright with something sacred.
I didn't just get my dignity back, he said. I got my son back. And maybe, I added softly, yourself. He nodded, voice warm with conviction. I'm not done living yet. And the truth is, neither was I. Sometimes justice comes not in fire and fury, but in fresh air, a smaller house, a reclaimed name, and a son meeting his father on equal ground. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is living well and letting the ones who pushed you away feel the echo of your absence long enough to recognize your worth.